Welcome back to our Civil War discussion for our history class. Alright, so the last video we talked about the secession of several southern states from the Union because they were angry about Abraham Lincoln winning the presidency in the election of 1860. So let's move toward the beginning of the Civil War. So just to kind of recap, we discussed that Lincoln won the election, the Republican candidate, in 1860, and that led to South Carolina leaving the Union. States joined them because they were fearful that Lincoln secretly supported an end to slavery, and they were concerned about the continuation of slavery and their economic prosperity. All right, so last thing we discussed was the creation of a new country, the Confederate States of America. That was led by, they elected their own president, Jefferson Davis. They had their own constitution that legalized slavery and allowed the states to have more power than the national government. That doesn't start the Civil War, though. The Civil War starts in 1861, and it doesn't start just because the South leaves the Union. Lincoln was still hoping that once he became president that he could negotiate and compromise the South back to the Union. Of course, we know that's not going to be the case, but that was the hope anyway. Let's talk about Fort Sumter and the first battle of the Civil War and how we get to the first battle of the Civil War. When Lincoln took the oath of office, the nation was divided. And in his first inauguration, tensions were very high. There was concern that he might be assassinated at his first inauguration, and he is the first president-elect to have security at his inauguration. All right, so once he became president, though, Lincoln was still hoping to compromise and help the South come back to the Union. Okay, so the first issue that Lincoln faced had to do with a fort in Charleston, South Carolina called Fort Sumter. I actually have a photograph of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So let's leave that up for a little while we talk about Lincoln and Fort Sumter. When the Confederate States left the Union, they took over most of the federal arsenals in their territories. A federal arsenal is a fort, usually manned by U.S. troops, where the U.S. keeps arsenal of weapons in case we are ever threatened. And there are federal arsenals or forts in most of the U.S. states around the country. Again, it's to prepare for a threat or an invasion, and that's why we have arsenals around various parts of the country. So that's what Fort Sumter was. Fort Sumter was a federal fort manned by U.S. troops that happened to be in South Carolina. When South Carolina left the Union, Fort Sumter remained in the hands of the U.S. government. In other Confederate states, the soldiers abandoned the fort and the Confederacy took over the forts, but not Fort Sumter. Creative Commons. One of the things I have is a map of the U.S. in 1864. And this is South Carolina, and Fort Sumter was in the city of Charleston, which is it's a coastal city. So it's about here. And this is a map that shows you the division of the country by 1864. So it shows you the Confederate States of America, the yellow here, the light yellow, that's the United States of America, and everything in gold are territories. Those aren't states at this point. So these are the free states, these are the slave states, this is the Confederacy, and this is the states that remain loyal to the Union. However, there are some border states that had slaves that remain loyal to the Union also, like Missouri and West Virginia, which I'm going to get to in a minute. All right, so let's talk about Fort Sumter and how this became the first battle of the Civil War. The man who led the troops, the U.S. troops at Fort Sumter, was a man named Major Robert Anderson. And He didn't relinquish the fort once South Carolina left the Union. He kept his troops at the fort. And so technically that was a fort of the U.S. government in a foreign country, the Confederate States of America. So after Lincoln became president, Major Anderson sent the president a message. The message was that he had about 6 weeks left of supplies, and if he was not resupplied, he was going to have to abandon the fort and give the fort to the South. So this is Lincoln's first dilemma and decision he has to make as president. Should he send supplies to the fort, or should he just let the fort go to the Confederacy? And it was a difficult decision. If he sent supplies to the fort, that could cause a civil war. The South could get angry about that and they could declare war, and he didn't want a war. He was hoping to still negotiate. If he let the South have the fort, then if there is a civil war, that would have been a valuable fort that he could have used to his advantage in the heart of the South. So he decided to send the governor of South Carolina a message telling them that he was sending non-military supplies to the fort. He wasn't rearming them, he wasn't sending more troops. But before the supplies arrived, the South fired cannons at the fort on April 12, 1861, and that is the Battle of Fort Sumter. And in that battle, the fort falls in about 4 hours, and the South took over Fort Sumter. Major Anderson had to surrender. That was the first battle of the Civil War. Lincoln was not going to let that incident go without consequences. And he declared this was an insurrection. He called for volunteers to join the military to stop the South's rebellion, and the Civil War has begun. And once the Civil War began, more states left the Union. So then we have Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, all leaving the Union after the Battle of Fort Sumter. So again, we have all of these states in the red that have left the Union. All right, let me discuss Virginia for a minute and West Virginia. After Virginia leaves the Union in April of 1861, there were about 25 Virginia counties, mostly in the North and West, that refused to leave the Union. And they wanted to remain loyal to the United States. So they held a meeting of what was known as West Virginian leaders in Wheeling, West Virginia. And it was known as the Wheeling Convention. And it met in May. They began meeting through the fall. And they drafted a new state constitution. They created new state boundaries. And they asked the U.S. if they could be admitted to the Union as a new state. So before the Civil War, there was no West Virginia. There was just Virginia. This was just Virginia. But because Virginia voted to leave the Union, and not all the counties agreed with that, the county leaders here asked to be accepted as a new state. And on December 31st, 1862, President Lincoln approved West Virginia's admission as a state in the Union. So West Virginia is an interesting state. It is technically a slave state. There are people who own slaves in West Virginia, although not as many people own slaves here as they did in the rest of Virginia. But West Virginia, part of their constitution, said that they were going to gradually free their slaves, and their plan was to eventually become a free state. And I think the way it was written was that all the slaves living in West Virginia, once they reached a certain age, and I think the age was 18, they would be considered free. And so eventually all the slaves that lived there would be of age and would be freed. That was the plan anyway. So that's where we get West Virginia. If it wasn't for the Civil War, there would be no West Virginia. So West Virginia remained loyal to the Union. Technically, it was a slave state that was part of the United States, and the rest of Virginia stayed with the Confederacy. All right, let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of both sides in the Civil War. The North, also known as the Union, their advantage is they controlled most of the nation's industry. So they had the supplies, clothing, ammunition, weapons, shoes, tents, mostly are made in the North. And if you think about it, those things that I named aren't all weapons. You know, to fight a war, you need more than bullets. You need more than guns. You need tents. You need clothing. You need shoes. There's a lot of supplies that are manufactured that you need to fight a war that aren't made in the South. And so that's a big advantage for the North is the supplies. The other advantage for the North is the railroad. The North has much more railroad track laid down by the 1860s than the South does. And that meant that the North could quickly move supplies, they could quickly move troops toward battlefields, and the South has to rely on the roads, which is a much slower means of transportation. So that's an advantage of the North, the Union. The South, the Confederacy, their advantage was solid military leadership. Their general throughout the entire war was Robert E. Lee. He was from West Point. He was an excellent strategist, and he was really their stable leader in their military throughout the entire war. And I have an image of him too. This is Robert E. Lee. So I would put Robert E. Lee as the advantage for the South because the North is going to really struggle to find an adequate general. And it's not until the end of the war when they find Ulysses S. Grant that the North finally has a more stable military leader. But up until that, the North really struggled to find good military leadership. Robert E. Lee for the South was a good military strategist. He was solid, he was competent, and he was kind of their steady leader militarily. Excellent military strategist. So that's the advantage of the South and a disadvantage of the North. And I'm going to talk more about the North struggle with their leadership later on. The South's disadvantage really is the lack of supplies. Supplies win wars, and the South has a supply shortage during the entire war. And that is something that Robert E. Lee and the leadership of the South really could never overcome. So that really, really hurt the South was the lack of supplies. Early battles and strategies. The first major battle of the Civil War is the First Battle of Bull Run in the summer of 1861. In July of 1861, Confederate troops settled about 25 miles south of Washington, D.C., near a creek called Bull Run Creek. Now, Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, and so the North did not want the South to be too close to their capital, so the North sent an ill-prepared army there to challenge the Southern Army. And again, this became known as the Battle of Bull Run because it was by Bull Run Creek. The North ended up losing the battle. One of the Confederate generals was General Thomas Jackson, and he was given the nickname Stonewall Jackson after that battle because his soldiers took on a great stand against the Union troops like a stone wall, and that's where that nickname came. And the North was unable to push the Southern Army away from Bull Run. So that was a first loss for the Union, for the North, but a victory for the Confederacy. Let's talk about the North strategy. The general who created the North's initial strategy was an older general named General Winfield Scott. And his strategy was a three-part plan called the Anaconda Plan. So who was General Winfield Scott? Let's talk about him for a minute. He was actually born in Virginia in the late 1780s. He was an American general. He had been a general in the Mexican-American War. He ran for president in 1852 as a Whig candidate, and he lost to Franklin Pierce. When the Civil War began, even though he was from the South, he stayed loyal to the Union. He remained part of the United States. And he helped to, remember I said that Lincoln had bodyguards at his first inauguration? Winfield Scott organized the bodyguards for Lincoln at his first inauguration. Now, you might wonder, why wasn't Winfield Scott named the general of the troops of the North, since he had such experience? Well, when the war began, Winfield Scott was 75 years old, so he was very old, especially in those times. I mean, today, 75, we don't think of that as too old, but back then, that was very senior. He also was very overweight. He needed help getting on his horse. So he was out of shape, he was overweight, and he was old. And so, for all those reasons combined, he couldn't serve as a general in chief. But he could strategize, he could make up a strategy. And he was trusted to create the Northern strategy to win the war. And he called his plan the Anaconda Plan because the North was going to squeeze the South into mercy like an anaconda snake squeezes its prey. And this was a three-part plan that he had created. The first part was to create a naval blockade of the South's coastline to prevent supplies from being sent from Europe. Because again, the North knows the South doesn't have supplies, so they don't want them to get supplies from Europe. So they're going to have a naval blockade, kind of block ships coming in with supplies. That's the first part. The second part of the Anaconda Plan was to get control of the Mississippi River as a supply route for the North and as a way to divide the South and prevent the South from using the river for supplies. So that was the second part, was gain control of the Mississippi River, kind of divide the South and use it as a supply line. The third part was place Union troops at key points along the border to stop the Confederacy from invading the North. And Winfield Scott believed if the North did these things, the South would surrender in a year because they wouldn't have supplies, they wouldn't have the Mississippi River, and they wouldn't be able to invade the North to get supplies. And he predicted that, well, we're going to cut them off some supplies, cut them off from movement. They're going to be squeezed into submission like a snake, and they'll surrender in a year. Abraham Lincoln had concerns about especially the last part of the Anaconda Plan. He liked the first two parts, but Lincoln disagreed with the idea that the South would surrender in a year. Lincoln believed that the only way the South's going to surrender is if the North destroys the South. So he wanted to be more aggressive in the third part of the Anaconda Plan. He wanted to have the North invade the South and conquer key areas of the South to force them back to the Union. So that was the one part of the Anaconda Plan that Lincoln had concerns with. The man who was named the General in Chief of the Northern troops was General George McClellan. So he was considered the first General in Chief of the Union troops. So in the next video, we're going to look at how the Civil War continues, the issues with McClellan, and we're going to get to the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'll see you in the next video.